In this video, I'd like to introduce the overarching narrative structure of all of Matthew's Gospel. As we do this, we'll be using narrative critical techniques rather than redaction criticism. Of course, narrative criticism looks to things like the plot and design of a narrative in order to figure out the interests of the author from the structure of the narrative itself. First, I'd like to lay out an outline of the whole gospel so that we can see its rough order and organization. This outline is from Ray Brown in his Introduction to the New Testament. I'd like to point out the beginning and end first. In the beginning of this gospel, we have an infancy narrative, which we've already looked at. And at the end of the narrative, we have the piece that was so prominent in Mark's gospel, a passion narrative, although here we actually have resurrection scenes as well, a more amplified version of the resurrection. Think of these as kind of bookends to the gospel, an infancy account and the passion resurrection narrative. We'll be spending a little more time in this video on the intervening 5 parts: the proclamation of the kingdom, ministry and mission in Galilee, the questioning of and opposition to Jesus, teachings on Christology and ecclesiology, or notions of the church, the community, and the proclamation of the kingdom that comes in chapters 19 through 25. Now, Brown has his reasons for labeling these sections as he has, and those will become a little clearer in a moment. Let me lay out those 5 intervening blocks and focus on those with you. These are the 5 sections in the middle of the gospel between the bookends of the infancy narrative and the passion resurrection account. Part of the reason that Brown is confident dividing the gospel into these 5 parts is that each one of them concludes in a similar fashion. Each one of them concludes with what we might call a sermon or a discourse, where Matthew has gathered Q teachings and Markan teachings from his sources, as well as some unique Matthean material on Jesus' teachings, and created a kind of a discourse where all of these teachings are fused. So the first one is probably the most familiar to us. The first book or section of Matthew's Gospel ends with the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7, 3 whole chapters dedicated to the teaching of Jesus. Clearly, this is an important set of teachings, given that it's given the inaugural position in this grouping of 5 discourses. Then we get the mission discourse at the conclusion of the section on the ministry and mission in Galilee. Then we get the parable discourse, where a lot of Jesus's parables from Q and from Mark, as well as some unique Matthean ones, are collated. Then we get the discourse on the church in the section on ecclesiology, or the teaching on the church. And the final discourse is what's called the eschatological discourse. That's drawn from a Greek word, eschaton, which means the end times. And so the eschatological discourse, or apocalyptic discourse, is the discourse on the end times. Now, Mark had one of those himself in chapter 13, but clearly, as you can see, this one runs 2 whole chapters. And here we'll find parables and other teachings related to the end of times. Now, I want to suggest to you that Matthew has patterned these 5 sections and the 5 discourses in what's called a chiasm, in a chiastic pattern, chiastic being the adjective that's built off of chiasm. So I want to introduce what a chiasm is. It's a plotting technique that can happen on a very small scale, and then, as we'll see, at the structural level of a gospel too. This is a plotting technique in oral discourse, or even at the level of a narrative, whereby the author arranges information in a particular order and then reverses that order, like on the way back out. And as I've said, it can be done at the level of single words or phrases in one teaching, or it can be done at the level of narrative units. Now, there are a couple examples I want to introduce. These first 2 in Matthew chapter 12 and 13 are at the level of words or phrases. These will make it really clear just how a chiasm works. And from there, we'll go to the structural use of this technique and see how the whole gospel's 5 books and 5 discourses may be laid out on a chiastic pattern. So at the level of words or motifs, here's a passage out of Matthew chapter 12. Then they brought to him a demoniac who was blind and mute. He cured him, so that the one who had been mute could speak and see. All the crowds were amazed and said, "Can this be the son of David?" To identify a chiasm, you want to see if there are words that are introduced in a certain order, and then we back out of those in reverse order. Turn the video off and see if you can identify those before I show you what they are. I've color-coded them so they're more obvious. Blind in the first phrase matches up with seeing in the second phrase. Mute in the first phrase matches up with mute and speak in the second phrase. Do you see how we back out? We start with blind, but we end with see. Then we move to mute, and the second to last element in the second phrase is mute, or something related to being mute or being able to speak. We can diagram this chiastic pattern in this way. Blind is A, whereas C is A prime. It's the flip side of blind, right? It's the cure for blind. Whereas mute is matched with the second reference to mute and speaking as the solution, because this, of course, is a healing. So the problems in the first part of the phrase are undone, and the person is able to speak and see. So that's one example. Here's another. The reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, "You will indeed listen but never understand, and you will indeed look but never perceive." Now, intriguingly, the teaching in this passage is kind of opposite to the effect of the healing in the last, where the blindness of somebody was actually cured. Now we're at a point in the story where blindness can't be cured anymore. But turn the video off and give yourself a moment to see if you can identify the words that we back out of in the second part of the saying. Here I've diagrammed it for you. I've colored in pink, dark and light, the phrases that are similar to each other, and in green, the phrases that are similar to each other. But of course, what's going on here is a little bit more complicated. The pattern is a little bit different. It's not clearly a straight backing out, because in the second frame, we don't go D, C, B, A. We go C prime, D prime. They're paired together, and then A prime, B prime. But the chiasm is still there. Sight and hearing, and then hearing and sight. But again, notice there's not a cure here. There's not a solution. Those who can't see, those who can't understand still don't at the end of this passage. Now I want to propose to you that this same chiastic pattern may be operative in the structure of the gospel, at least these central 5 discourses. So here, I've not given you the titles of the whole chunks of the gospel, the whole book that ends with a discourse. I've actually given you just the citation of the 5 discourses. And I want to suggest that we can diagram these also in the manner of a chiasm. Let me show you what that would look like. The assertion here is that the Sermon on the Mount is the A to the A prime of the apocalyptic discourse, and that the mission discourse and the discourse on community are somehow related. And that in the middle, in the pivot position in this case, is one parable discourse that is a sort of pivot where the action of the narrative or the plot changes or turns. Let me show you what I mean by this. We want to see what it is exactly that would make the Sermon on the Mount and the eschatological or apocalyptic discourse A and A prime. What relates them? I'm going to ask you to figure that out. After I've introduced what to do, turn the video off and see if you can identify any similarities between the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount on the left column and the conclusion, the concluding parable in the apocalyptic discourse in chapter 25. So turn your video off, and then I'll say a few things when you turn it back on. All right, on the left in the Sermon on the Mount, we have the familiar beginning. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who are meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. All right, this language is language of the covenant. That is, if someone is poor in spirit, if someone is mourning, if they are meek, if they are righteous, they are the ones who are blessed. They are the ones who are abiding by the covenant. And usually these blessings are matched by curses in covenant language. If you don't do these things, you will be cursed. This is typical covenant language. It's reminiscent of the covenants of the Jewish scriptures. And in that context, it's interesting where we are. Matthew has Jesus go up a mountain to deliver these Beatitudes. And of course, then the whole Sermon on the Mount follows. And the Sermon on the Mount follows with things like Jesus saying, "You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. What I say to you is, you shall not even look with lust at a woman." Jesus takes literally Moses' 10 Commandments and reinterprets them. So the Mosaic allusion is quite clear. We're on a mountain. Jesus is reinterpreting the law. And the Beatitudes or blessings here are absolutely covenant language. This is what you must do to be blessed, all right? Or if you are ethical in these ways, you will be blessed. This is God's promise. On the right side, we have the final judgment scene. We have the Son of Man coming in glory for the final judgment. And he separates the sheep from the goats. The sheep are those who are blessed. All right, there's our language of blessing or beatitude again. It's time for the reward. And why do they get the reward? Because when this Son of Man says, "He was hungry, you gave me food. When he was thirsty, you gave me drink." The hungering and thirsting for righteousness is similar to the notion here, although here it's very prosaic. Did you feed someone when they were hungry? Did you visit the imprisoned? Did you visit the sick? And of course, those who are damned are those who don't do this. Those are the goats, right? So in both cases, the Sermon on the Mount's beginning and the eschatological discourse, we are getting an ethical system. But notice who is present. On the left at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is up in the Galilee. He's in Jewish territory. He goes up the mountain, reminiscent of Moses and the covenant, and his disciples come to him. We are in a Jewish context. We are going to get the Jewish law reiterated. But in this vision of the end times, the Son of Man is coming on the clouds of heaven. This is a judgment of the entire world. When he sits on his throne of glory, it's all the nations, not just the Jewish nation, that is gathered before him. And so this ethical system is the bare bones of the Jewish covenant. This is the bare bones of what God expects of all people. So there's a parallel here. We have covenant language in both sermons, and this is the way in which the Sermon on the Mount may be A to the eschatological discourses A prime. Here is a second example from the Sermon on the Mount. Again, you're going to pause the video to see if you notice any similarities between the passage on the left, which is the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and this passage in the eschatological discourse, the closing of the judgment parable. So here, what I see is this motif of people saying, "Lord, Lord," as if that's somehow enough to claim that they are following the covenant of God. And as Jesus reiterates in the Sermon on the Mount, anyone can say that, but that doesn't mean that they'll enter into the kingdom of heaven. So we see the sort of judgment against those who don't understand in the Sermon on the Mount. In the eschatological discourse, at this point, we're with the goats. And these are the ones who gave no food when someone was hungry, who gave no drink when someone was thirsty, who gave no welcome or clothing to the naked or visit to the sick. And even though they claim that they would have done this if they had known it was the Lord, the Son of Man says to them, "You didn't do it for the least of these. That is the Lord." Now we could do the same exercise with the other two partnered discourses, the mission discourse and the discourse on community. These are B and B prime. Now the mission discourse is clearly oriented towards the disciples as they're about to go in and bring more people into the community. The discourse on community is also oriented to the disciples, but it's about how they're to behave within community. So let's do this exercise again. On the left is a passage from the mission discourse. On the right, the discourse on community. Take a moment, pause the video, see if you see any similarities. What I see here is that at the beginning of the mission discourse, Jesus is summoning his disciples and giving them authority in his name. So they're going to be acting in his name. And then we hear the list of them. In the discourse on community, it's the disciples again, the ones to whom he's given authority. And they want that authority. Who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus challenges them that there's a different way that authority is exercised within this community as they deal with each other. It's about humility. It's about becoming the least. Each one has to become like a child. in order to be an authority within this community. Here's another example. Same two discourses. Again, pause the video, see if you notice any similarities. What I see here is that we have this threat as they're about to go out on their mission that they will be arrested and killed. They'll be flogged, they'll be dragged before governors and kings. So there's this promise that they will be persecuted because of the message and the work that they're doing. But when we go to the discourse on community, where the concerns are not behavior in the outside world, but behavior within the community, the concern is about how the leaders themselves, the disciples, might be the ones who are punishing people inappropriately, putting a stumbling block, keeping them from believing, keeping them from understanding. So within the community, the concern for improper exercise of authority and leadership. In both cases, it's the exercise of authority, but in the left, it's about what they will encounter in the outside world, and on the right, it's what they better not do within the community. Now, according to the chiastic pattern, if there is a saying, or in this case, a discourse, in the middle position with no parallel, there's a way in which the chiastic structure focuses on that pivot point. This discourse serves structurally as a kind of place where we shift from the orientation of what comes before the first two sermons, and as we move toward the last two. So let's see how the center of the chiasm functions as a plot pivot. And here I have just one passage. So pause the video so that you have time to read this, and then I will point out a few things. So the parable discourse is a pivot. The type of pivot it is in the plot of Matthew, I'd like to suggest, is that we're moving from the discourses that are oriented towards behavior in the world of the disciples first, according to the Mosaic covenant, and then as they go out and share the message of Jesus to their fellow Jews, so the mission discourse. The discourses that follow this pivot discourse are oriented towards the community itself, that is, how it should exercise authority within and govern itself, and then also what it should anticipate, how it should behave, how it should be in the world in the final days, how it should behave, right? So the ethics for all the nations in the final days. The parable discourse then is the pivot where we move from the point where Jesus' message and mission are outward directed toward the point in the plot where it's inward directed. At this point, it's clear that Jesus' life will be ending in an execution. At this point, he turns inward because the resistance in some circles is too strong to continue working outside, and the focus will turn to the disciples. So we're at that pivot point. And of course, what we see in the parable discourse, after the very initial parable, which is the parable of the sower, we have the disciples coming to Jesus and say, "Why are you speaking so much in these parables?" And Jesus says, "To you it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven." Right? To you, the community whom I'm about to pivot, but to them it has not been given. For those who have, more will be given, so more will be given to you, disciples. But for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. So the outsiders who were resisting in this gospel, primarily the Pharisees, the parables function to prove that they don't perceive, that they don't listen, that they don't understand. And Matthew, in his penchant for adding prophecies that are fulfilled, says that this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah. So the outsiders will not get it, and Jesus, at this point in the gospel, begins to turn away from them and focus on shaping the community so that it's prepared for his inevitable death. So here again, the chiastic structure in the gospel, which is an interesting structuring feature that may be pertinent for the discourses that characterize the end of each of the 5 major sections of this gospel. Now I want to point out one other feature, and this has to do with the overall shape of the gospel itself. It's also a kind of chiastic structure. We'll use another term for it here, though, and that is a narrative inclusio. An inclusio is a literary device based on a concentric principle, also known as bracketing or an envelope structure, which consists of creating a frame by placing similar material at the beginning and the end of a section. I just drew this from Wikipedia, but this sort of inclusio or bracketing principle, bookends we might think of them, is a way I think that this gospel's been structured. There are some clues or cues that we get between the infancy narrative and the passion resurrection narrative. So now we're stepping outside our 5 major sections with their sermons and looking again at the infancy narrative and passion narrative. And I just want to show you an interesting feature of how these are structured. Let me sketch it all out for you, and then I'll walk you through each part of this. This is the diagram of the chiastic structure of the inclusio, what we see in the infancy narrative and its structure, the passion narrative and its structure. So let's walk through this. And I'm going to start at the middle, which is really the end of Matthew's infancy narrative and the beginning of the passion narrative. So we have the return to Israel from Egypt, right, to the place of danger rather than the place of safety, and of course the journey to Jerusalem in the passion narrative, which will end in Jesus' death, which sort of fulfills what is being telegraphed in the infancy story, that danger awaits Jesus in Israel. We have a massacre of infants that Jesus barely survives in the infancy story, which is matched in the passion narrative with the actual massacre or execution of Jesus. It actually happens at this point in the story. Now, before that, in the infancy, Jesus escapes from death because the angel appears to Joseph and they get word in time and they're able to escape to safety in Egypt. There is also a kind of escape or victory over the threat that we get in this gospel in the resurrection. The death is not the end. There is a kind of escape or defeat of it in this gospel. Before the escape, we hear the prophecy that a ruler will arise for Israel. This occurs in the scene where the Magoi come to Herod the Great, and he asks the scribes to comb the scriptures. Interestingly, this ruler, this motif of the real ruler of the Jews, the real king of the Jews in the infancy story, is matched at the end of the gospel with the statement that Jesus, the risen Jesus, assumes all authority, not only on earth and not only in Israel, but on heaven and earth. So this assertion of the authority of Jesus is made in the infancy story and at the conclusion of the gospel. And furthermore, and lastly, we have the first prophecy that is fulfilled in the infancy story, which is the angel saying to Joseph in his dream when he first discovers his fiancée is pregnant, that this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah, of Emmanuel, which literally in Hebrew means God with us. Interestingly, the risen Jesus' final words to his disciples is, I am with you always. So again, the inclusio, the use of a chiastic structuring pattern to design the narrative to reinforce the themes that are most important for the author.